Hi and welcome to Magic Numbers. This is episode number 144, which is 12 squared if you're into numbers, and probably you are if you're here. And today we're going to be talking about evaluating heuristics. And before we go into the main topic, I would like to thank my sponsor, mgazone.com. I would like to thank my patrons, of which I have two that are new, and that is Christian and Robert, also known as 17 Lands. That's a very good patron to have. So thank you very much for your patronage. It does help to get this show on track because it keeps me wanting to record while I could have been drafting. So cheers to all of you, and you know who you are. Also, thanks to my other sort of sponsor, Bulkbox. If you need boxes to store your stuff, get a bulk box. It's very good. I use it, and I used it before they started collaborating with me, so they're pretty good. Okay. Preamble. I have not touched the replay data for many years, even though it was always there, because it was always a tough thing to touch. It requires additional levels of analysis, and I was never interested in doing that kind of stuff. But I got a bit better in coding, and now with my newly acquired skills, I'm super happy to dig deeper into the nitty-gritty of the replay data. And at that moment, I basically discovered it's so much more that you can get out of the data if you start looking at those numbers. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to be making one kind of deep dive episode at the end of each format that is dealing specifically with the replay data. Here, 5-second break. Thanks for the raid to Mercurio Blue, who is like the Labrador of the Magic the Gathering Limited community, an amazing person, always friendly, the pillar of the community, and also rating me, which is great. So there's more of you in the chat. We are just literally starting the seminar. We're going to be talking about deep dives into the data from Limited, looking at some heuristics, and thanks for the raid, and for those in the chat, because you didn't hear it. Please do ask questions if you have some questions to the seminar, because that will help people who are listening to that as a podcast. If I'm not clear about something, it's not only you, probably, it's probably multiple people. So it's good to ask for clarification. And obviously, I'll try to go back to your questions as much as I can. All right. With that out of the way, again, I always considered working with the replay data challenging and difficult, and never touched it. Now I started, and it looks like there is so many questions you can answer by digging into this data set. Because normally what I do is I look at the win rates, I look at the deck composition. Here I can look at much more specific questions, like what happens if you don't cast a creature on turn 2? Which creatures can attack on turn 6 efficiently? How does the game look like? Is card draw mattering? Mana spending, how does it impact the game? And I've touched on that data from time to time. The easy to pluck from the data set, I tried to look at it, but the more complex questions, I left them because they require way too much effort for way too little reward. But I think that we're entering the stage of the data analysis in Magic when we have to look at those deeper data sets and try to answer more basic answers about it. And it's not only useful for us as a player, it's also useful to know from the set design perspective what's going on in the games, and how can you, for example, make a format slower, faster, and which cards can be the tools in changing the speeds of the format, for example. All right. With that out of the way, we can talk about the main topic, and that's looking at lots of different chunks of data. This is my experimental kind of approach to looking at this replay data. So I tried to test multiple things to some extent and try to use it as a sort of pointer strategy to get more questions in the future. And of course, I can't answer everything in the seminar for the first time I analyze this data, but I can actually get some good ideas of what can be analyzed, what is easy to analyze, and what is challenging, and what questions I can answer with that. So first heuristic I'm going to look at is the thing that you can hear a lot from content creators: spend all your mana. And we do hear a lot of that, but how does it look like when we confront it with data? And the method I did was basically looking at how much mana did player A spend, how much mana did player B spend, make a difference from those two, and calculate win rate for each difference. And I calculated them specified by the turn the game ended. So if the game ended on turn 7, I look at the difference between player A and player B and on how much mana they spent throughout the whole game. And if player A spent 2 mana more during the game, I can calculate the win rate for all the games that had a 2 mana difference in mana spending. Because I calculated both for the 17 lands users and their opponents, you will see that the middle lane is going to be 50% win rate always, because obviously if both players spend the same amount of mana and the difference is 0, one of them is going to win. So the win rate is going to be 50%. But everything different, you will see some kind of a difference in the win rate, hopefully. And here is the graph. What you have here is the difference in the mana spending. So let's say here, this player spent 4 mana less than their opponent. And if the game finished on turn 9, which you have here, and they spend 4 mana less, their predicted win rate is going to be 33%. So there's a massive difference when you spend less mana than your opponent. And obviously, this kind of graph is made in such a way that on the opposite side, when you spend 4 mana more than your opponent, you will naturally have the other part of the win rate, so 66%. What you can see is that mana differences are in short games are dramatic. So in very fast games that end on turn 5, just spending 1 more mana than your opponent is going to result in 71% win rate. Obviously, this has to combine 2 things. A, game ends very quickly, and B, you spend more mana. Obviously, if you spend more mana, you're much more likely to win the game. But even in the game that lasts like 11 turns, which is pretty long, even if you spend only 1 mana more than your opponent, you are going to have a 52% win rate. If you spend 2 more mana, 56. If you spend 3 more mana, it goes up to 63. So outspending your opponent on mana is one of the ways of gaining advantages, and that happens, from dramatic changes in those games that are very short, to less dramatic but still significant changes in the games that are much longer. And 12-turn game, 1 mana extra is only 0.4% extra win rate, but 2 mana, that already brings you to something like 58% win rate, or 57% when you spend 3 more mana. That's like probably some variance in there because of the sample sizing. And in those very lopsided games, when you spend 5, 6, you're entering the 70%, 80% win rates when you outspend your opponent to that extent. And of course, this has something to do with deck building. If you build your deck in a way that you can spend your mana efficiently across the turns of the game, you're going to outspend your opponent more frequently. If you have enough 2-drops, you're going to have a turn 2 play. And we're going to look at it later. Having a turn 2 play is quite important. If you have a turn 2 into turn 3 play, all of a sudden you are advantaged in that game if your opponent missed any of those steps. Or, for example, play 2-drop into 2-drop. That's also something that will probably lower your win rate, because the threats that you're deploying are less effective. But as you can see, quite a cool graph, and it shows you that outspending your opponent on mana is going to make you win more by quite a lot. So does it matter what you spend your mana on? And I look at creatures here. And I looked specifically at a statistic. So what happens in games when both players spend the same amount of mana? Does casting more creatures matter? And here is the result. So basically, in the games where the difference in cast creatures and mana spending was exactly equal, the win rate is going to be 50% because of how the graph is constructed. It looks at both the 17 lens user and the opponent. But if you only cast one more creature, even though you spend the same amount of mana as your opponent, you're already going to have a 53% win rate. If you cast two creatures more, even though you spend more mana, you're going to have 55% win rate. And this sort of suggests that it doesn't only matter how much mana you spend, but it of course matters what you spend them on. And I think it's underappreciated how much you can win just by deploying enough threats. Even if your opponent has a removal, they sometimes will have to trade their removal not optimally, because you can present your threats in such a way that they will have to deal with them, but they will not have to deal with the best of them. And if you have enough creatures that you can deploy, eventually you're going to outrun your opponents. And there will be some decks that are less reliant on creatures and more on spells. There will be some formats where maybe this trend is less developed. But here we can see that for most of it, until we go to like 4 creature differences, it's quite linearly increasing the win rate the more creatures you cast. So casting 3 creatures more than your opponent, despite spending the exact same amount of mana throughout whole the game, you're going to have like 57% win rate. Then there's this drop off when you cast 4 creatures more. And I think that this is a signal of the decks that exist, which have lower reliance on creatures and higher reliance on spells. It would be interesting to repeat this analysis and look at different archetypes, color pairs, and maybe try to figure out from that. And what this tells me is that there are decks that should have like as many creatures as physically possible, versus there are decks that completely ignore that kind of numbering, and they can deal with creatures in a different way. And then you want to go more all in on the spells. And probably there's some kind of a middle zone where you're not having enough creatures to be an effective threat, but at the same time, your spells are not good enough to be an effective spells deck. And this is something I'm going to try to figure out in Ether Drift. How can we go deeper into that kind of analysis? And can we actually find which deck should have how many creatures, and which deck can get by with fewer, which deck has to have maximum, and where are those optima for different archetypes? I'm going to try to look into that. Obviously, at the risk of sample size might be a bit small for analyzing that properly, but still, it's going to be interesting to see what's going on in there. Okay, and when we talk about the mana efficiency, and maybe some of you did see it because that was my last Twitter thread, I decided that I'm going to limit my Twitter activity to basically, can I call it shit posting? And maybe some like memes or whatever. I'm not going to put the serious thread content on Twitter anymore because I'm angry with the current management, and I moved that kind of activity, basically only to Blue Sky. And what better thread to have as your last one on Twitter than Bolt the Bird? And I bolted from the bird. Thank you, Thierry. That's a very kind comment. I'm going to publicly shame you. Obviously, the slide that I have says, first person to tell me that elf is not a bird in the chat gets publicly shamed. But okay, let's start from the beginning. Bolt the Bird is the heuristic based on the idea that killing the turn 1 mana dork is beneficial because it stops explosive starts. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows that. And it's sort of assumed that it works. I'm pretty sure it works. And when I started doing that analysis, I was quite convinced that it does work. I just want to know how does it work and to what extent it does. And luckily, Foundations, which I took my data from, has Llanowar Elf at common, and that makes it a perfect set to test this heuristics because we don't get that many standard legal sets where there is a 1 mana dork at common. So that's quite a rare situation, but that gives us a good sample size to test questions related to that. Now, of course, here comes the public shaming. Obviously, elf can be a bird. There is one elf bird in Magic. Unfortunately, it's a double-faced card from Strixhaven. But one side is an elf and the other side is a bird. So there is a elf bird. that could be bolted. Also, both sides die to bolt, so that's perfectly. Okay, so how did I test the bolt the bird heuristic? Basically, I tried to look how does the turn 1 elf impact the games of the deck that has it in, and particularly a lot of those analysis will be looking at, is there a difference of deploying things on the play or on the draw? And partially it's because I think it's interesting to see if there are differences between how card behaves on the play and on the draw. But secondly, because the replay data is weird and analyzing it on the play and on the draw is necessary, because the order of turns is different. So I have to make different scripts for on the play and on the draw. And once I do it, I might as well show you the on the play and on the draw statistics, because they are sort of a corollary of how the data is organized and how I can analyze it. Because, of course, if I look at what happens on turn 3 and I want to see what happened the turn before, on the play, your turn 3, to compare it with the previous turn, you need to look at opponent's turn 2. If you're on the draw, if I want to analyze the previous turn, I need to look at opponent's turn 3, because you're on the draw, so you go second, they go first, blah, blah, blah. So first of all, I looked at the win rate of deploying Llanowar Elf or not deploying a Llanowar Elf from the decks that have Llanowar Elves in them. And on the play, depending on how many copies of Llanowar you have, your win rate is sort of between 64 and 68% when you play the turn 1 elf. That's a lot. That's a very high win rate for playing Llanowar Elf on the play. If you didn't play the Llanowar Elf on the turn 1, which I can only assume means either you didn't have green mana or you didn't draw the elf, the win rate goes down to something like 55, 56%. On the draw, it's around 63, 64% if you played the elf on turn 1, and it drops down to 51, 50% if you didn't play the elf on turn 1. So the elf decks are heavily reliant on the elf. The games when you play the elf are having massively higher win rate. The difference is 12%, 9%, something like that, in that range. And mulliganing is 15 percentage point difference. So basically, not having Llanowar in your opening hand is almost worth mulliganing for, in terms of if you hope that you can get the elf once you mulligan. And in a deck with 3 copies of Llanowar Elf, that is actually possible. So there is something to be said about mulliganing hands without the elf if you have a deck with like 3 copies of it. You might be slightly behind, but if the hand is iffy for some other reasons, that should be something for you to consider, especially when you're on the play. But of course, the elf will not win on its own, except for that one game in the pre-release when it did win on its own for me. And by on its own, I mean I also had the Anthem and the Leyline Axe. But it did win on its own. Thank you very much. Most of the games, when you don't have a Leyline Axe and an Anthem, probably you need to follow it up with some other creatures. Otherwise, it's just a vanilla 1/1 that doesn't do much. So I also looked at what happens in those games when you play the elf, depending on how much mana you cast. And here is the graph that shows you the win rates on if you cast Llanowar Elf on turn 1, depending on how much mana was spent in the next 2 turn cycles. And obviously, if you don't spend anything, your chances look pretty grim. So the win rate drops to like 40%. You spend 1 mana, it still sort of stays in the 45s. You go to 50% win rate when you spend 2 mana. Now, keep in mind, this is only 17 Lens users data, so the average win rate is around 55. So you're still below average. Once you get to 3 mana, you're getting better. But the real benefits of the elf games is when you spend 6 or 7 mana. And there, on the play, when you spend 6 mana on turns 2 and 3, you have a 73.6 win rate. If you spend 7 mana, which is the maximum that you can with the turn 1 elf, if you don't cast any other mana dorks. That goes up to 77.6%. On the draw, it's much less efficient. There is roughly 6 percentage points difference in how efficient it is. But you still spending 6 mana after turn 1 elf is 66% win rate. Spending 7 mana after you cast a turn 1 elf is 70% win rate. So if you can follow up your elf with a 3-drop and a 4-drop or 2 2-drops or whatever, you're so much ahead in those games that there's almost nothing that the opponent can do. And this is the power that Llanowar Elf has on the format. And when you build the decks around Llanowar Elf, you definitely need to think about having the 3-drops a bit more than you do. Because just following it up by a 2-drop is not necessarily the best thing that you can do. So the question is, how often do you manage to carve out so efficiently when you cast your turn 1 elf? And good news for people that play Llanowar Elves in their deck is that relatively well, around 43% of the games, 40% of the games end up with those carve outs when you spend 6 or 7 mana in the next couple of turns, which will result in those 70% kind of win rates, which is good. 4 out of 6 games is not too bad. You add another 18% of the games when you spend 5 mana, so something that would normally possibly happen. And that covers like 60% of the games. However, still there's way too many games where people spend much too less mana after casting that elf. And this is the problem of ramping in Limited in general, that if you're ramping, you might as well be spending that mana. If you don't manage to spend that mana, well, the whole point of ramping is sort of missed. Okay, but this is nice, and this tells us a lot about what does the proverbial bird / elf do in your deck. But it doesn't tell us much about what bolting the bird does. How much of a hit in your win rate do you get if the elf dies before turn 2? So luckily with the replay data, I could test exactly this scenario. And I looked at the win rate on the play and on the draw with the turn 1 elf cast, depending on whether it was not killed or it was killed. So if it was not killed on the play, you got 66.8% win rate. And if it was killed, it drops down to 52.3. And this is quite a large hit. On the draw, 64% win rate if it survived, and 50.8 if it didn't survive. So another 14% percentage point drop in the win rate. This is, relatively speaking, the same impact as mulliganing. And this just shows you just how big an asset in your deck is Burst Lightning or Stab. This cheap removal that can target this turn 1 elf is going to send your opponent into oblivion. And here is the important bit, in my opinion, in this analysis, and that's like, okay, killing the elf before turn 2 is at best card / mana neutral, because it's you most of the time have to spend a card, and most of the time you spend 1 mana. Sometimes you will spend 2 mana when the opponent is on the draw. So how does the getting your elf killed compared to not having it in the opening hand, I think, was the important thing to look at. Also because there is a very interesting result. So in red, we have the win rates of what happens when the elf was played but then killed. And in blue, we have the win rates of the decks that contain Llanowar Elf where it was not played on turn 1. And even though it's neutral on mana and cards in the best case scenario, you still are ahead on that exchange by killing the elf. So the win rate, if they didn't play it, 54.7. The win rate when they played it but it was killed, 52.3. So despite them playing paying 1 mana for the elf and playing 1 card, and you paying 1 mana for Stab and using 1 card, you're ahead in that exchange because that's how big a hit it is to kill that elf on turn 1. It's true that only good decks can kill the elf on turn 1, and it's true that also it doesn't happen very frequently. But that just shows you how good is that exchange. And most people do know that stab is good and burst lightning is good, so everyone will put them if they can. But of course, decks with them are better. Okay, that concludes the part about bolting the bird, or in my case, stabbing the elf. So now we can talk about another aspect of the game, which is card advantage, because we talked about mana. Why not talk about the second important resource in Magic, cards? Cards are somehow deemed important. I don't know why. People love drawing them. People tend to prioritize having more of them than the opponent. So how important is it exactly? And here I calculate net cards drawn difference, very similar like I did with mana. I basically calculate how much net cards did the player get. And by net cards, I mean it's cards drawn minus cards discarded. And I calculate it for both players, and I deduct those two numbers from each other to get the difference in the net cards. And we have a similar graph than the first one, where here we have the net card difference, with 0 being they drew the same net amount of cards, and -1 is the player drew fewer, +1 is player drew more. And then the turn the game ended is also important. And here we can see that for majority of the game, drawing more cards is good. So from turn 7 onwards, drawing one extra card is sort of 4 to 7 percentage points in win rate, basically. So it's 50% because how I look at the data of both the 17 lens user and the opponents when you have a net 0, because both players will have the net 0. Average win rate will be 50% if you look at the totality of Magic. But just drawing that one extra card means that the player who drew the extra card has a roughly between 4 and 7 percentage points advantage in the win rate. Depends on how long will the game last. But in short games, card draw is as a hindrance. So in the games that lasted 5 turns, the player that netted fewer cards by 1 has a 61% win rate, and the player that drew 1 extra card has 38.6% win rate. So it does make sense that if you want to kill someone really, really quickly, you cannot waste time on drawing cards. And if someone is trying to kill you very, very quickly, you better not waste your time on drawing cards, because you should be wasting your time on playing defensive speed creatures to stop the attack and make the game last longer, because those super aggressive decks don't fare well in longer games. Siver says that it seems hard and limited for those games to happen at all. Yes, but this is based on 200,000 games that I analyzed, and there was still enough of those. I think I only looked at the data points that have over 500 games. So there were at least 500 cases of those games when games ended on turn 5 and someone drew different numbers of cards during those games. It does help that even though there's only 200,000 games I looked at both sides of the match, so it sort of doubles the sample sizes in a weird way. Because I look at not 200,000 games, but I look at 400,000 players. So that's maybe a better way of looking at it. So yeah, I mean, obviously, the closer to the middle, the more the higher the sample size. So there are more. Most of the games have 0 difference in the net differences. But as you go for longer games, those differences will be more pronounced. And I told you that it's 1 card makes around 7 percentage points difference. 2 cards will add more to that. So when there's 2 card difference in net card draw, depending on the length of the game, it's going to be between 59 and 63% win rate. If you draw 3 cards more, it's between 61 and 67. And when you go to 4 more cards, we're going to maybe 75% win rate advantage across the games. So huge advantages of outdrawing your opponent on the cards in those games, that even in the games that only last like 8 turns, which might be considered as a relatively fast game. But still, even in those kind of relatively short games, the card draw is a massive benefit in most of the games. Okay, drawing is not the only way of getting card advantage. So I decided that maybe with this data, I can actually look at the benefit of looting, rummaging, and other sort of card selection mechanism that don't necessarily net you card, but give you a more card selection. So here I look at the situations where both players net drew similar amount of cards, but the draw, only the cards drawn, not the net cards drawn, had differences. So, for example, if one player drew 4 cards but discarded 4, and the other player drew 10 cards and discarded 0, they net drew the same amount of cards. They drew 10 cards. But player A saw 4 cards more, so they had more selection based on what they were drawing. And does it give any advantage? And here, I think the most important part is this middle column, where the net card draw difference is exactly 0. So they had exactly the same number of cards that they drew. But the cards drawn difference is, let's say, 2. So if you net drew the same amount, but you saw 2 cards more and then you looted them away in some way, that gives you around 54% win rate. If it was 3, all of a sudden you get like 63% win rate. And there is something weird happening here where seeing 1 extra card does not give you an advantage, although it's a small difference and that can be attributed to just natural variance. But it can also be attributed to the fact that I counted discard without looking at what type of discard it was. Maybe a discard that is caused by burglar rats is not exactly beneficial for you because you don't get the sort of looting benefit out of it. So maybe those games are creating some noise in this kind of data. And then, of course, once you draw an extra card, you definitely improve when your cards drawn difference is not existent because you drew the extra card. But actually, looting does not give like that amazing advantage. It's still something that clearly has advantageous repercussions, but it does not give those benefits just for small increments. Looting is good when you do a lot of it. And doing a lot of it probably means that you can some repetitive source of looting rather than one-offs. So at least in foundations, I would be cautious about like one-off loot effects, but I would be very keen on having those the ones that can do it multiple times. Like, I don't know, the blue-black signpost uncommon is of course the best you can get, but also the 1/2 flyer that can loot for 2 mana is not a terrible thing if you plan to play longer games and you want to get your advantage through selection rather than netting card draw. The issue, of course, here is that the decks that are good in looting are also good in card drawing, so maybe this is not the best format to analyze the impact strictly of looting, because if you're playing a looting deck, you're also having card draw most likely. That was for the card draw. Now we can move to another topic, which is 2-drops and how much matter. How much do they matter? And if you watch any kind of content creator, you will hear a lot about how 2-drops are important. And I think that is a very important thing that content creators in Limited do, because I still think that there's lots of people who just don't put enough 2-drops in their deck, that don't draft them highly enough, will pick a 7th 5-drop instead of picking the 2-drop that they so desperately need for their deck because the 5-drop looks more appealing. Well, of course it's more appealing because for 5 mana you should be getting more than for 2 mana. The point is you can't get the 5 mana thing to do anything useful on turn 2. And that's why the 2-drops are so important, because there is this predominant heuristic that if you miss your 2-drop, you're very much disadvantaged in the game. So that's exactly what I decided to look at. I looked specifically what is the win rate of a 17 lands user if they play or not play a 2-drop on turn 2. And by 2-drop here, I mean only creatures. No, I don't look at spending mana on a spell for 2 mana. I just strictly look at creatures. And then also looked at the opponent, whether they play or not to play a 2-drop 2, and looked at the impact if 17 lens user was on the play or on the draw. When is this casting the creature important? So here are the numbers. If both players play a 2-drop, on the play, 17 lens user has a 56% win rate, on the draw 53. This is something that is close to the average win rates of the format in general. If only the player plays a 2-drop, 17 lens user plays a 2-drop, this goes up to 62.5 on the play, so you got a 6 percentage point increase in the win rate when only you play the 2-drop, and 60.4 on the draw, which is 7% more than 7 percentage point more than if both players cast it. If an opponent only casts the 2-drop, well, the win rate of a 17 lens user dips below 50% at 49.2. So that drops from the average of 55 roughly. So quite a significant hit. And it's higher than 55 on the draw. 55 is a generic win rate, so probably it's closer to this 56% when both players cast. And on the draw, if opponent cast a 2-drop and the 17 lens user didn't, that drops to 47%. So the range between one player playing a 2-drop and the other playing a 2-drop spans like 13-14 percentage point of the win rate. So 7 percentage points in each direction roughly hit, depending on who plays the 2-drop. No, I only looked at the turn 2 2-drop creatures being cast. But I think that the most interesting part of this particular graph is what happens when neither of the players casts a 2-drop. And then the win rate of the 17 lens user is 55.8 on the play and 55.3 on the draw. And this is fascinating because in all those comparisons, the on the play win rate is quite significantly higher than on the draw. But when neither of the player casts a 2-drop, all of a sudden there is not much difference in win rate on the play or on the draw. So doing nothing, and there will be more about it later, but doing nothing has an impact on the game duration. This is not something that is super unintuitive, because of course when nothing happens for the first 3 turns, the game is not going to end early, and if the game is not going to end early, the longer the game lasts, the more advantage the player on the draw is. But it's nice to see that also, like, the 2-drops matter in the way of shortening the games and therefore giving this on the play advantage, which is something to consider during the set design. If you want slower sets, maybe you should have fewer 2-drops or better answers to 2-drops, just so that no one can start snowballing, which is the problem with current sets, and best of one, where the person on the play curving out perfectly on the line will have something like 60% win rate just for the sake of curving out, because all the cards are reasonably pushed, and because of that allow you to be so much ahead when you start deploying your threats first. Okay. So that from the 2-drops, we can move to the speed of the format. My beloved topic. I get asked about it all the time. So is the duration of the game impacted by how much mana players spend? And what is that relation? And I looked at mana spent by both players in the first 3 turn cycles. So turn 1, 2, and 3. Without discerning what the mana was spent on. So I didn't look if it was creatures, equipping things, I don't know, mana burn. I guess you can't have mana burn nowadays. Whatever the mana was spent, it doesn't matter just how much mana was spent. And we have this kind of graph. Here we have the player A and player B, because we look at generic players. I did the same analysis for the 17 lens user and for their opponent, and then I flipped it. But first thing that you can see is that equal mana spent. So if both players spend 0 mana, the game lasts 10.3 turns. If both players spend 2 mana in the first 3 cycles, 10.05 turns. If they both spend 3 mana, 9.79. And these numbers go down and down and down. If both players spend 6 mana on their first 3 turns, so maximum that you can spend without acceleration of some sort, the game lasts 9.12. It gets shorter and shorter the more mana players spend. And this is not something that is obvious to me, honestly. I would expect that, yes, if one player spends a lot of mana and the other doesn't spend much, the game is going to get shorter because they are going to be overrun. But I did not expect that in parity, both players spending mana is going to make the games shorter. This is a bit weird, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Why, when both players spend 6 mana in the first few turns, all of a sudden game is lasting shorter than if both players spend 3 mana? It doesn't really make much sense to me. But potentially, it means that if they both spend mana, one of them will spend mana more efficiently, and maybe, looking at spending mana on what results in better deals would be something interesting to look at it. But I don't know, chat, maybe you have better ideas than me what happens in there. Why spending more mana by both players is dropping the length of the games. But then, of course, you can look at the extreme examples. If one player spends 0 mana and the other one spends 5 mana, the game lasts only 8.66. So Siver in the chat says, if they don't spend mana, they have more cards and it's harder to break through. Maybe that's the reason that the threat of activation makes people freeze and the game gets into a stall. But interesting. The open mana, maybe that is the answer. I will have to look at it. So yeah, generally the game is the longest, the less mana has been spent. You can see that in this graph quite clearly. Obviously, there are very few games where players spend only 1 mana because there's so little to be doing for 1 mana. But yeah, if you spend 0, the game is longer. If you spend 2, both spend 2, the game is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. And those disproportion also look at the disproportion between players. So obviously, if shortest games are if one spends nothing, one spends quite a lot. They end in a jiffy because there is, of course, no defenses, good attacks all the way around and whatever. So I did the same graph, only looking at the 17 lens users. And there are some differences here. So first thing is that when the 17 lens user spends 5 mana and the opponent spends 0, those games are shorter than when looking at both players, which means that 17 lens users are better in closing the games. So it was 8.66, now it's 8.51 when we look only at 17 lens user having that advantage, which means that the non-17 lens user is going to have much longer games, even if they outspend the 17 lens user by 5 mana in the first couple of turns. And it's the reverse when the 17 lens user is outspent. It's 8.8 when non-17 lens user is outspending the 17 lens user by 5 mana, while it was 8.66 here because this is just symmetrical in this particular graph. So that means that 17 lens user, because they have a higher win rate, are much better as front runners, but are also much better in prolonging the games when they are behind. And this is something to indicate what kind of skills you need to have a higher win rate. And this is A, closing games fast when you have an advantage. B, not letting opponent close the games when you don't have the advantage. And those graphs showed quite conclusively that 17 lens users are just better than the generic user of Arena in doing those things. So yeah, I would think that spending all mana by both players would lead to board stalls, but no. When both players spend the same mana, the more mana is spent, the shorter the games are. And this is something I found a bit counterintuitive, and I will really need to go deep into that thing somewhere in the future, maybe in the new set. So potentially this is where card quality plays a role. Players spend the same amount of mana, but they don't spend it on exactly the same kind of things. And one of the players is going to be behind, and that's going to snowball because despite them spending the mana, they are falling behind, and because they are spending all their mana, they don't have interaction, which makes clear decisions for the other player. So I can see that happening. What Severe was saying, that you know, I play a 2-drop. My opponent plays a 2-drop. I swing with my 2-drop. Opponent blocks. I play a 1-mana combat trick and a 2-drop. I spend all my mana. Now I have 2 creatures. They have 0. Then they play a 3-drop. I attack with my 2-2-drops. I play another combat trick and a 2-drop. And now I have 3 creatures. They have 0. And despite both of us spending the same amount of mana, I was always ahead in those exchanges because I had, like, I don't know, a stab or a combat trick, and I was able to convert my mana into massive board advantage, even though my opponent was trying to catch up with it, but doing the wrong block. Okay, and the important thing that I noticed is that 17 lands users prolong games where they spend less mana and make the games where they dominate and mana usage shorter than the non-17 lands users in the dataset. Isaiah, maybe the opponent shouldn't have blocked. Yes, that is something that I would definitely advise. Open mana, weird attack, just let it slide. Let it slide. You don't want to be blown out like that. But it does happen all the time. Severe was thinking more like 2-drops trade and then 3-drops trade, and then the 4th thing stays over and takes over the game. This is also another thing. And yeah, again, this is the kind of thing that I'm hoping to test in the future using those data sets. I just didn't have time to go super deep into one of those topics because I wanted to cover as many possible topics as possible. But these are the kinds of questions that I would be looking for inspirations from the chat, or from, if you're listening to it as a podcast or watching on YouTube, leave a comment and let me know what kind of analysis would you think about. Okay. And the last part of the seminar today is looking at good attacks. And this, I have to admit, is the one that I had least amount of thinking, because I was running out of time, and I finally decided, look, I have to put out this seminar because it's been too long and I don't want to be irrelevant, because in internet, when you're silent for 5 minutes, all of a sudden you're outside of this news cycle and you fall back into irrelevance. And despite me not being professional in content creation, I still want that content to be listened by someone at least. So I had to rush that one a bit. It's not that the analysis is great. It's just thinking about the potential of what I can see in there. I didn't have as much time as I had for the other things. So I will be improvising a bit. But part of a creature's range is having good attacks. And I wanted to check, how does it look like in a game? How can I quantify creatures having good attacks? And I decided I'm going to do the same mistake that I always complain about in the economy, where the economy is sort of assuming a rational consumer. And anyone who has been in the supermarket hungry knows that we're not rational consumers. We just buy random crap just because we're hungry. And I assume a rational player that attacks only when they have a good attack. And I know from myself, not every attack I make is a good one, but that's the assumption I'm making here. The calculation I made was creatures on board at opponent's end of turn versus creatures attacking on the following 17 lands user's turn. So if on the opponent's turn 2, I had Helpful Hunter on board, I count it, and then I count how many times does a Helpful Hunter attack on your turn 3. So technically it was there. It was possibly available for attacks. And then I can calculate, did it attack or did it not attack? And first analysis is looking at all the creatures. Just all the creatures on every turn. How many of them were there present a turn before and how many of them are attacking? And I look at turns in the range from the turn 3 to turn 10, just because I don't think that it's super interesting. The turn 2 attacks and turn 1 attacks don't exist. Oh, is there a hasty goblin? Yeah, there is a hasty goblin. Maybe they do exist, but they are rare. Also, hasty attacks are a scourge of this analysis because they mix everything up, as you will see in a second. Haste is the awfulest mechanic for this analysis, but I think that it's not significant enough to cry about it. So first of all, there is a big disproportion between being able to attack when you're on the play and when you're on the draw. On turn 3, 73% of your creatures that were present there in the earlier turn cycle are capable of attacking, and on the draw it's only 56% of the creatures that you have on turn 3 that are capable of attacking, that can attack. That's a massive disproportion, and this is one of the reasons why it's so good to be on the play, because you deploy your threats first, you can attack with this open mana and force your opponent to either block in a weird way or to let you go through because you are threatening mana and having something that can use this mana. But as the game goes longer, and by the way, this is turn 3. This is not games that ended on turn 3. This is just every turn 3 in all the games that were logged in those 200,000 games. As the game lasts longer, the difference becomes smaller. So here we have 17 percentage points difference between attacking on the play and on the draw. On turn 4, that difference shrinks to just 12 percentage points. Around 2/3 of the creatures can attack on the play. Around 54% can attack on the draw. Turn 5, it drops further down to something like 8 percentage point. So 60% can attack on the play, and 51.5 can attack on the draw. Turn 6, even further drop. Now we're dropping to something like 7 percentage point difference, 53.3 versus 37.7. Turn 7, even further. There's only like 2 percentage points difference, or 2.5 percentage points difference, 46.4 to 43.7. At turn 8, it becomes relatively even, maybe 1 percentage points difference. And at turns 9 and 10, the player that was on the draw is more likely to attack with their creature. The differences are very small because it's 36 to 36.5 and 33 to 33.9. And I assume if I would run this analysis even further, the advantage of being on the draw and being able to attack is going to get more and more pronounced. So interesting result when starts very disproportionate, and on the draw you definitely don't have many attacks. But as the time goes by, being on the draw slowly and slowly becomes more advantageous. And this is why being on the draw, you should be able to have some kind of a late game plan in the deck, because the longer the game lasts, the more advantaged you are as a player who was on the draw. This is maybe a scourge of some of the ultra aggressive strategies, that if you're ultra aggressive, you cannot go into the longer game, but if you're on the draw, you might want to play a long game, and this is something that might cause problems to those hyper aggro decks. Okay. Then I decided to look at individual creatures and see some information about what's going on in them. And this is the part where I didn't have like tons of time to think about it, but there are some interesting pieces of information. So this is for the most commonly present on board creatures for each of the turns I'm going to look at. And what you can see here is that, first of all, evasive threats are good in attacking. So when you look at Healer's Hawk or Strix Lookout, those things can attack almost like 92, 95% of the time, or when you're on the play. On turn 3, Healer Hawk was capable of attacking 93% of the time when 17 Men's user was on the play, 80% of the time when they were on the draw, and similar numbers for the Strix Lookout. Some creatures are very bad at attacking because they are not there for attacking. Llanowar Elves only attack 20% of the time on the play, and 13% of the time on the draw. Some creatures are just not made for attacking very well. You have a bunch of those one drops: Infestation Sage, Helpful Hunter, Burglar Rat. On the play, they could attack 60% of the time. On the draw, they could attack roughly 40% of the time. So these creatures have other merit in your deck. Helpful Hunter and Burglar Rat allow you to get the card advantage. Infestation Sage is like a sack fodder. Sometimes we'll be attacking because no one wants to have the 1/1 against them, because the 1/1 from Infestation Sage will be quite good to attack. And then you have just regular 2-drops. Hungry Ghoul, Wary Thespian, Cathar Commando. Those things can attack roughly 80% of the time. So much more than the 60 from the 1 power creatures. The 1 extra power gives you 20 percentage points more attacking capability. And on the draw, they will be more like 60 to 70% of the time attacking. Cathar Commando is the interesting one. Because it's a flash creature, it is capable of attacking both on the play and on the draw, because you can deploy it maybe slightly surprisingly, and that gives it the extra potential for attacking. And here we have the Courageous Goblin, which can also attack 90% of the time and on the play and 72% on the draw. And here I think is an interesting case of a creature who has good attacks because it's so dispensable. You're attacking a 2/2, and they can have like a much better creature, like a Johnny's Pridemate that is a 2/2, or Hungry Ghoul that might become a 2/2. You can jam that Courageous Goblin into those things without any kind of drama, because you just know that you don't care. If you trades, it's a trade up because it's the worst possible 2-drop that you can imagine. And I think there is some merit in those kind of honest creatures that you don't care about sacrificing very easily. And also maybe Courageous Goblin is often played in conjunction with some of the other goblin, the 3-mana 3/2 that gets a counter. So you can just jam the Courageous Goblin. If they don't block it, fine, they did 2 damage. If they block it, you trade. That's also fine, and you drop a 4/3. So maybe that's the kind of a product of the decks that the card has been in. Then good attacks on turn 3. And here we see the impact of the Llanowar Elf. Beastkin Ranger attacked 98.6% of the time that it was capable on turn 3, because turn 2 Beastkin Ranger will give you almost always a good attack. And there might be slight interference in this number from the 2-drop that gives haste in red-green decks. That might have boosted that number a bit higher, because unfortunately in my analysis, when you cast a turn 3 Beastkin Ranger and give it haste, my analysis does not see that, because it only looks at the presence of that creature at the end of turn 2. So there is a small caveat that number might be, I don't know, 5 percentage point different in reality because of some cases of the card getting haste. It shouldn't be much though, so I wouldn't think that the difference would be that big. I just think that genuinely turn 2 Beastkin Ranger will almost always have a good attack. 98% of the time they can attack. And by the way, this is like different. This is just the list of the creatures who have best attacks on turn 3 from all the creatures that were there in the data sets that had a sample size of at least 500. Other creatures that can attack well: Strix Lookout, Giada, Healer's Hawk, Spectral Sailor, Mischievous Mystic. These are all flyers. They have around 90 to 82% attack rate on turn 3. So flyers, good early, because you can almost always attack with it. And then there is a group of cards that are either easily disposable or they have a threat of activation in Drake Hatcher, Slumbering Cerberus. That's the 4/2 that doesn't untap unless something dies. Courageous Goblin and Diregraph Ghoul. And I guess that Cerberus, Goblin, and Ghoul are sort of disposable creatures. You jam because you're quite happy to trade them off. Drake Hatcher is more like a threat of activation creature, where you attack with the 1/3 Drake Hatcher with open mana. It would take a mad person to block it, because best case scenario, your 2-drop just stops 1 damage. Worst case scenario, your 3-drop dies while opponent is casting spells, which is not cool. Also, yes, severe. There might be the case where the Courageous Goblin does have menace when it attacks because it's been turn 2 Courageous Goblin into turn 3 dog or snout or the Cerberus, and it has menace and it can attack quite easily. So maybe there is also quite a few cases of that. Given the sample size for the Courageous Goblin, I think that won't be majority of it, but might be a large fraction of it because 10th biggest sample size for any 2-drops in the set. That's quite a lot, I would say. Oh yeah, by the way, I didn't mention these are in the order of the largest sample size to the smaller sample size. These are the top 10 creatures that have attacks on turn 3. How does it change on turn 4? Well, not by much really. It's still the flyers that have good attacks, whatever happens. Healer Hawk, Dazzling Angel, Strix Lookout have good attacks. Beastkin Ranger still has good attacks on turn 4. So it attacks like 90% of the time, even more than the flyers. And yes, as Chad noticed, or actually Sever noticed, we have a creature called Cat because, of course, 17 lands logs every type of creature, including the tokens, and Cat tokens do appear quite a lot, and they have sometimes good attacks. 50% of the time on the play, a player managed to attack with a Cat token. But yeah, still things like Helpful Hunter and Burglar Rat can attack around 40, 47, 48% of the time. But this is much smaller than much less than in the turn 3, where they had 57, 61% of the time that they were capable of attacking. So they can attack a good 10 percentage points, 13 percentage points less than they could before. And same goes with Infestation Sage. The ability of that card to attack is diminished. No, Cat is not the 9th most likely creature to be able to attack. It's the 9th most common creature to be on the board on turn 4. These are in order. These are in order of most creature on board, and then 10th most. And of course, this goes much further because there is roughly 100. Oh, maybe for turn 4 there's like 83 different types of creatures that 17 lands logged to be able to attack on turn 4, and these are the top 10. These are the most likely creatures to attack on turn 4, and you will see that there's something off with the numbers. Flamewake Phoenix attacked 146% of the time that it was capable of attacking. Yeah, because it has haste. Same with the Brazen Scourge, 121% of the time that it could attack. Whatever. The creature that was capable of attacking the most percent of the time was Soldier, actually, token. And I think that has something to do with Soldier tokens appearing from Resolute Reinforcements, which are deployed mainly when they can be attacking. So, of course, Soldier also has haste because it's heroic reinforcements. Yeah, Siver, that's exactly the chat. The chat quickly points me to the right answer. From the creatures that are not hasty, Alicia, who laughs at Fate, is the most attacky creature, 88%. Vampire Nighthawk, flyer, obviously, is also something that will have good attacks. And we still see those Goblin Borders, which is amazing given how low the win rate of that card is, that it has such good attack, which just shows to me that having a good attack does not necessarily mean that a creature is a good creature. Goblin Borders is probably a creature that is pretty decent when you're ahead, but it's absolute trash when you're behind, and that's, I think, what kills it as a creature. Beastkin Ranger, on the other hand, still solid 84%. That's less than previously 98, but it still can attack relatively frequently. And what we have here to close out is 2 flyers, the Dreadwing Scavenger and the Strix Lookout, and Inspiring Paladin, another creature that is so much better when you're ahead and so much worse when you're behind. And then there, like turn 5, we see a still slight drop in how much can Helpful Hunter attack. This time we drop to 39 from 46, so roughly 7 percentage points drop as well. We still see the flyers being good in attacking. You have Healer's Hawk, Dazzling Angel, Fairy Token, and Strix Lookout at roughly 75 to 80%. Elves still don't attack, 17% of the time only. Infestation Sage still attacks more frequently than Helpful Hunter and the Burglar Rat, which I would say that there must be something like the threat of activation in Infestation Sage. So I attack with it. I dare you to block into my open mana when I can have Fake Your Own Death, for example. So that maybe makes that creature attack a bit better. And then a creature that appears on the list for the first time, I think. Oh, maybe not. Hungry Ghoul has... oh, no, it was there before. Hungry Ghoul has 62% fraction of attacks on turn 5, but it's 10 percentage points lower than on turn 4. Yeah, and also, of course, there's the threat that the flyer will just appear, but I think that it's even worse when not only the flyer appears, but also your thing dies and they get the Infestation Sage back plus a treasure. Okay. Most popular things to attack on turn 5 are, again, Flamewake Phoenix and Brazen Scourge because they have haste, Soldier because they have haste, and from the regular creature, we see the same collection: Vampire Nighthawk, Soldier, High Fate Trickster, Dreadwing Scavenger, Goblin Borders, Strix Lookout, and Beastkin Ranger. And almost all of those creatures have some kind of evasion, flying, menace in case of Goblin Borders most of the time, and Beastkin Rangers, just no need for evasion. Yeah, 126 is a quirk in the data because, of course, I have a number of Flamewake Phoenixes on board at the end of turn 4, and that's what I calculate as my baseline. But also the ones that are cast on turn 5 and can attack with haste are counted into those numbers. That's why the number can be over 100%, like it was on turn 4 when the same haste creatures were having over 100%. This is just a quirk of the data. I can't really get used to get rid of it unless I make a fringe case for every single scenario, which I didn't really feel like doing, honestly. I have better things to do with my time than excluding haste creatures from my analyses. So I kept them, and I will show them just to show you the limitation of the study. Because once I remove those, then what stops me from removing the creatures that gain haste through the activation of the ability of the what's the name of the 2-drop in red? Something from Kaldheim, whatever. The Kaldheim dude that gives haste. And then you can go deeper and deeper, and you fall into your rabbit hole that Axgard Cavalry, that's the one. Yeah, and that there's the issue with this kind of things in the analysis. I still think that majority of the data can be done without looking at those fringe cases. Now we fast forward to turn 8, and while in the previous turn 4, 3, 4, 5, you see that there is a big advantage of how well you can attack while you're on the play versus when you're on the draw. Those differences all but disappear on turn 8. So if on turn 5 we still have those differences that are ranging between like 5 to even 15 percentage points in case of Dazzling Angel. By the way, this is a stunning result that Dazzling Angel on the play attacks 76% of the time. Dazzling Angel on the draw 61% of the time. So massive difference in how flexible it can be as an offensive threat and as a defensive speed creature. That's probably one of the reasons why the card is good. On turn 8, those differences disappear almost entirely. Yes, like Strix Lookout can attack like 3 percentage points more frequently. Dazzling Angel can attack 2.5 percentage points more frequently. But the rest is just like disappearing. So Cats can attack 25% of the time on the play and 25% on the draw. Helpful Hunters, 26% on the play, 26 on the draw. Burglar Rats, 29 on the play, 29 on the draw. There's no difference between those things. Things that can attack a bit more. Weirdly, goblins, maybe because red paves the way for them to attack. Fairies can attack more than ground creatures because flying is so beneficial for that. So they attack 50% of the time. Felidar Savior, 36% of the time. Bigfin Bouncer, 43% of the time on average. So those ground creatures better have free attack if they want to be attacking on turn 8. But these are, of course, the most common creatures that you can see on the battlefield, and these are not the ones that will have the best attacks, I guess. So when we look at it, best attacks, it's still Flamewake Phoenix because of the haste, and we still see the collection of the same things. Vampire Soulcaller, Serra Angel, Vampire Nighthawk, Skyship Buccaneer, Dreadwing Scavenger, Dragon. All of them are flying. The only non-flying creature there is a Brazen Scourge, which probably has the elevated numbers because of it being hasty, and Coma, which has good attacks because it's huge, massive, and also there is a big incentive of attacking with it. So that's what we're getting in the most attacking creatures late, which is funny because we saw much more ground creatures in turn 5 and turn 4, but as the game goes longer, it's the evasive threat that are the ones that are capable of making attacks more frequently than not. And same results for the turn 10. Here the difference are all gone, and actually a bunch of creatures are more likely to attack on the draw, including Healer's Hawk and Strix Lookout. Most of them are relatively the same. They have fewer chances of attacking compared to turn 10. So the cats that could attack quarter of the time now can only attack 20% of the time. The fairy tokens that could attack half of the time now can only attack 41% of the time. So the capability of attacking as the game goes longer just decreases. And that's probably why those board stalls can be broken by evasive creature, and they should be the focus of your deck if you want to have a good late game in your deck. I think that this kind of result shows how important evasion is to break the board stalls. If you're planning for a controlling game, you need something to go through. And you see which creatures attack the most in the turn 10. Vampire Soulcaller, well, it does attack because what else will it do? It cannot block, so you might as well swing with it. Serra Angel, you might as well attack with it because it got vigilance. Nighthawk, you might as well attack with it because it has lifelink. So even if something attacks you back, you sort of recoup that difference by having the extra life gain. Vampire Gourmand, yes, it doesn't have flying, but it can get through by making it unblockable. Dreadwing Scavenger, because you have benefit from attacking with it, and it's evasive. Runescarred Demon, Soulstone Sanctuary, by the way. Well, that's just a land, but it does have vigilance, so you might as well swing with it. Arbiter of Woe, another big flyer. Cephalid Ink Mage, which should have unblockability at that time, and because of that has good attacks. And Dragon Token, probably from the 5-drop 1/1 that makes a 4/4 dragon. I think that's the dragon that we're counting here. And yeah, these are the creatures that attack the best. And as you see, almost all of them are flying creatures. So I would say if you're planning a deck that wants to play a long game, have those flying creatures. And if you're planning to defend against decks like that, the 1/4 reach thing with Death Touch probably quite a decent creature in those kind of decks if you want to stop your opponent from finding a way to attack you on those later turns. All right, and that's it for the data today, and that's it for the seminar as well. So I would like to thank 17 Lands, who are now my patron, which is great. And thanks to Jake Brown. Follow him on Blue Sky if you want to have a nice update of his a window into his great and weird at the same time brain, because it's worth reading. He's got this thingamajig that he releases every week with his thoughts about Magic, and some of them are too weird, but some of them are just the right amount of weird that should be probably read. And I would highly recommend it because Jake was always helping me, so I can help him for that one. So check what he's writing about in the Blue Sky and subscribe to his list. And with that, I'll see you next week when hopefully we're going to be slowly moving into the new set and starting to speculate about what's going on with the cargo vroom vroom set. And with that, I'll see you next week.